So welcome to our day 8 of our Novena of Grace. We're doing this just before we do our evening Mass, so you may see people walking about. And so I remember this story when I was a first-year novice, so back it would have been in the summer or late spring of 1996. And we were leaving the novitiate to make our summer retreat in Ontario. And I remember in the first day of the retreat telling my retreat director, Father Monty, this new insight that I had in this new practice that I was doing. And that is, I had decided that there was no need for me to bother God with my prayers as in requests for things. And so I decided that I would rather just do my job as a Christian, which I was aware of, and God then would be free to spend his time with others. So I thought this was a great act of humility and generosity on my part. However, when I told this to Father Monty told me that I had taken the role away from God of being Father. That is, that I was depriving God of a cherished role. That is, God the Father caring for and giving grace, gifts to his child. So it was not the answer that I was expecting. Because in our lives, when we think of God's graces or God's gifts, we can understand them as being his expressions of his love. These expressions of the love of the Father, his daughter, or his son. Also, I remember again as a novice doing the spiritual exercises with regard to preparing for what's called a general confession. So a confession that would include the whole of one's life, from your first memory of your first sin all the way up to that present moment. And so I was expecting around a certain time in the retreat that I'd be asked by my retreat director to prepare, because you were given a day or two to prepare for such a long confession. However, my retreat director, Father Pat, he hadn't asked me to prepare, so I then asked him whether or not it was time I should begin to prepare for my general confession. And then Father Pat sort of leaned back in his rocking chair and chuckled, and he said, "Oh, John, no, you're not going to do the general confession. Rather, I want you to write down all the gifts that God has given to you in your life." So I wasn't able at that time to do the general confession. And then fast forward 15 years later or so, I was doing the long retreat again of the full spiritual exercises on this Jesuit program in preparation for final vows. And again, preparing for the general confession, the time had arisen in the retreat to do that. I hadn't been asked to prepare, so I asked my retreat director at that time, Father Roger, if it was time I should prepare. He then, I'm not sure how exactly he knew, but he imitated Father Pat. He leaned back on his chair, he chuckled, and he said, "Oh no, John, you're not going to do the general confession, but rather I want you to write down a list of all the things you're most grateful for." So a little different in the wording, but more or less the same thing. The reason both of them had me do this other activity than the one that was in the exercises was because they both said that I already thought badly enough about myself, so I didn't need to think any more about the mistakes, my faults and failings, my sinfulness at that time. In thinking back to that, at the time, of course, I was disappointed and angry, but thinking back, it was a real blessing, in fact, to look at one's graces or one's gifts, because again, these are expressions of the love of God the Father. In a sense, the ability or the freedom to look at one's sinfulness, you have to have a working assumption. And the working assumption is that A, you're loved by the Father, and B, that love is not in jeopardy. It's not going anywhere. And so because of that, that confidence in the love of the Father, it allows a person then to admit, to expose one's imperfections, one's sinfulness. Because as a Christian, that impulse to serve, it comes from the experience of the love of God, which then includes a sense of gratitude. So much so then the person seeks in gratitude, in love, to love God back. And that then is that dynamic of love within our hearts. Without that gratitude for the gifts and the love of the Father, then we always remain on the outside. We always remain in a performative sort of disposition, rather than it becoming internal or interior with the person. And so then we have that experience of that love of the Father, which then engenders that gratitude and the desire to love God back. Because in truth, with the meaning of God's graces, in truth, even though life can contain many hardships, even though life can contain prolonged periods of suffering, in truth, each of our lives, it's an overflowing of the gifts of God. When I think of myself at this point in my life at age 55 as a Jesuit priest, I have to admit that my entire life is just full to overflowing with these gifts. My entire life. I think of when I entered at the age of 25, and in many ways how my heart was closed off, how my world was really small. But now, so many people in my life, so many people I know who have great affection for me, who love me, who care for me. In the Jesuits, the brothers that I have, all these different things, again, my life overflowing is just a consistent gift by God to me. And I think every person, again, even though we have difficulties, even though we have prolonged periods of suffering, if we have the eyes to see, we can see those gifts of God. So much so that even in the face of enormous difficulty, those gifts of God are overflowing. Just thinking about one's day today, thinking about all the different kindnesses I had from other people, all of the different actions that I saw in a person in terms of their sacrificing something that they thought they had to do in order so that I could do this or do that. Again, you can see in the goodness of others, the kindness of others, also within one's own heart. Again, what we see is our life is overflowing with the gifts of God. And so I always remember this prayer of St. Francis Xavier, that God, I love you. And in my understanding of the prayer, this paraphrase is that St. Francis declares his love for God, but he says it's not because God can save him from eternal torment in hell. And he says, God, I love you not because you can give me the reward of heaven, but he says, God, I love you because you have loved me first. And as a Christian, as we see our God hanging on the cross with arms extended, with arms wide open, again, we can always know the love of God. Even in times of enormous difficulty, even in times of prolonged suffering. In truth, our life is overflowing. It's overflowing with the gifts of God. Because the gifts of God are expressions of the Father's love. And so then our lives are overflowing with the love of the Father. And so, God bless, and I'll see you tomorrow for day 9 of the Novena of Grace.